Harold, you are the 13th Arthur Goodhart Visiting Professor of Legal Science to be interviewed for the Eminent Scholars Archive. You're currently the Sterling Professor of International Law at Yale Law School, a position that you've held since 2013. You've been the Goodhart Professor for the academic year 2018 to 19, and we are very grateful for your agreeing to share some reminiscences of your life and career and your experiences here in Cambridge over this period. I hope you can also give us some thoughts on legal topics in international law. So could we start with your early life? You were born in Boston on December the 8th, 1954, and this was 16 months after the end of the Korean War. Your father was originally from what is North Korea, but he escaped to the United States. Can you tell us a little about your parents, how they came to the States and re-established themselves there?
Actually, it was my mother who's from North Korea. My parents are the inspiration of my life. My father's an international law professor, which explains why I'm an international law professor. His name was Hongju Koh, and he was from a very small island off the south coast of South Korea. So he was as south as you could get. It's called Jeju Island. It's a fishing it's a fishing village, and he was an incredibly hardworking student and was the first student from the island ever to go to Seoul, which was an astonishing. It'd be like someone from the Isle of Wight coming to London. At the time, the Seoul National University was controlled by the Japanese colonial forces. And so what he attended was called Keijo Imperial University, where he was the only Korean with one other fellow. And they were very heavily discriminated against. But my father took this as a challenge and was number one in the class, even though he was one of the only two Koreans. This created this incredible drive for achievement, really, to prove that Koreans could not be looked down upon. My dad passed away in 1989. He did not escape to America. He came as a student. In fact, we just found the materials. He got a scholarship from an educational institution in Princeton, New Jersey, which he misunderstood. This was in 1949. He misunderstood to mean he was being admitted to Princeton University to study law. Princeton doesn't have a law school, so he came all the way to America, went to Princeton, and they said, we don't have a law school. So he enrolled in a PhD program at nearby Rutgers University in New Jersey, got a PhD. He then went to Harvard Law School, got a master's LLM, and then got an SJD. And then finally, just to establish that he could practice law in America, he got a JD degree from Boston College Law School. And I'll say more about this in a moment, but his specialty was law of the sea, and particularly the study of fisheries. Next week, I'm arguing at the International Court of Justice about, among other things, Russia's theft of fisheries from Ukraine. So it's coming full circle in some way. I realized my father had a vision that was just very far-reaching. Now, my mother, Haesung Chun Ko, is from a very different walk of life. She's from a very well-to-do family in Seoul. She is still alive. When I get back from Cambridge, we'll have her 90th birthday. She gave birth to 6 children. She has her own PhD. She is the head of a research institute on Koreans and Korean Americans, and she's a sociologist. And my parents were the first Asians ever to teach law at Yale Law School, where they did in 1961. And my sister and I are now chaired professors at Yale Law School many years later. But what happened was that my mother's family had a summer home in North Korea, which is a very cool mountainous part of the country. And when the country was divided by after the end of World War II, they happened to be up there, herself and her two siblings, and was actually trapped inside North Korea for 3 or 4 months. And the Russians were in control. And she was recounting to me just very recently that when the Russians came marching down, they didn't know what to do, so they held up a sign, you're supposed to welcome them. She didn't like the Russians, so she put up a sign that said, "Welcome Allied Forces." And she was advised that, she was 17 years old, that the Russian forces were raping and molesting young Korean women. So after several months, she dressed up as a boy, and she and her two brothers hiked to the border. And my grandfather, who I never met, her father, sent a car to meet them. When they got to the border, there was no car. And then they just waited there for 10 hours or something, and suddenly a car appeared and took her south. Amazingly, a few months later, she went to America on a scholarship to Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. As a freshman, the war started, Korean War started, and Dickinson College is very close to the Army War College. And they sent a kind of distress signal saying, does anyone speak Korean? Because our generals need to know how to speak Korean. So my mother went over there as a freshman, she was 18 years old, and started teaching them Korean language. And then a few weeks later, she said to them, you can't learn Korean language without learning Korean history, and you can't learn Korean history without learning Korean culture. And so I want to teach these courses, and you can't do any of it without knowing Korean geography. So she taught all of these courses as a fresher. So she is a remarkable person, as you can tell. And so my parents were among the only two Koreans in the East Coast under the Korean Normalization Act. I think there are less than 1,000 in the mainland of America as opposed to Hawaii. And then by incredible coincidence, my father's dissertation advisor at Rutgers went to Dickinson, where my mother was a student, to give a speech. And my mother was his tour guide. And so he went back and told my father, there's this remarkable Korean woman not so far from here. So my father began writing her letters and proposing marriage and things like this, sight unseen. Eventually she agreed to a meeting, and then they got married. And I'm the fourth child of 6.
What an incredible trajectory.
Well, I think there are a couple things you can get from that. One is I'm an optimistic person, I think, by my history. It's a miraculous story, really. In fact, I'll tell a little bit more if it's not too much. The pivotal moment of my father's career came in, he was at Harvard Law School, and Syngman Rhee's government, which was sort of an American, being propped up by the Americans, collapsed. And my father's friend, John Chung, was the ambassador from Korea to Washington, wanted to run for prime minister. And my father was so popular in the south of Korea that Chung asked my father to go back and campaign for him. But my father didn't have any money. But he had just joined the church at Harvard Law School, right? It's right next to Harvard Law School. And so the minister of the church said to my parents, okay, on Sunday we'll tell you to leave the church and just take your family and walk out. So we did, and a few minutes later he came out and gave us several $1,000s. He had just called for the congregation to donate money so that this young patriot could go back to Korea. So my father goes back. They win the election, and he suddenly was offered every position. He was sort of the young star of the government. He then agreed to be the first ambassador to the UN, but and he was only 40 years old. The Korea was an observer nation. So then they said, we would like you to be the number 2 guy in Washington, the charge d'affaires. And this was the ideal position for my father. The year was 1960. John Kennedy had just been elected. And my father was constantly over at the White House. And everybody at the White House was somebody he knew from Harvard. And he was having the time of his life. And then, and we were living in Washington, D.C., the whole family. One day, my mother gets a call, and my father's at Dulles Airport. And he says to her, what I was worried about is happening. I'm going back to Korea. And it turned out he had been warned that the Korean government would be overthrown by a military dictatorship. And so he flew back and warned Chang, his mentor and boss. And Chang said, no, General Park Chung-hee will prevent this from happening. A few days later, General Park himself committed the coup, and they were all thrown out. By this point, my father was back in America, and he convened a meeting of everybody at the embassy, and he said, everyone must take a pledge. We will never serve a dictatorship. We will only serve a democracy that's governed by the rule of law. And everybody signed the pledge. And within a year, everybody broke the pledge except for my father. And he was exiled, and he never served in the government again. But he told me the story countless times. And his main point was that many people profess to care about the rule of law, but it's really kind of but they're weak-willed, and when push comes to shove, they don't live their commitments. Then the other amazing thing that happens, and then I'll end this little account, is that my father heard that Chang, his boss, would be executed and was under house arrest. So he went to the White House to see the Deputy National Security Advisor, who was a man named Walt W. Rostow, famous economist. And Rostow said to him, we know where Mr. Chang is. He will not be harmed. And my father was just staggered by the reach of American power, that this guy sitting in Washington could say this with certainty about something happening on the other side of the world. And then when it was over, and also I think he was stunned by what he thought was the goodness of American power. You know, obviously America's power has had many faces, but this gave my father a deep love of America, which I think everybody in my family shares, that there's a good America, and then there's a not so good America, but we have to keep calling America to its better angels. At the very end of the conversation, almost proving this, what Rostow says to my father, what are you doing now? And my father says, I'm exiled, and I'm unemployed, and I have 6 children. And Rostow says, don't you teach law? And my father says, yes. And he says, well, you know, my brother is dean of Yale Law School, Eugene Rostow. Let me call him. So he picks up the phone, and they have a very short conversation. According to my father, the conversation lasted maybe 10 seconds. And he couldn't hear what he said. And my father just assumed that nothing had happened. So he was getting ready to leave. And then Rostow said, where are you going? And my father said, I guess it didn't work out. He said, no. He said, my brother said, can you get here in a week? And a week later, we moved to New Haven. 40 years later, I was dean of Yale Law School. So So from these strands come a couple of things. First, I think this belief in human rights, that we have to fight for human rights. Second, that we have to be committed to the rule of law. Third, that we have to call American citizens have to call America to its better angels. And finally, that, there's a generous approach to life and a less generous approach to life. And, if you're lucky enough to be the beneficiary, then you have to take that generous approach to others. And so I've tried to live by those ideas, not imperfectly, but that's been the case. Now, there's a very interesting connection to Goodhart, which is when I was growing up in New Haven, Connecticut. My dad wanted my brother to get into a local boys' school, and it turned out the only way you could get in was to be recommended by someone who had gone to that school. And there was a guy, young professor, Guido Calabrese, and my father went to him and asked him, would you recommend my son as my brother to the school, which he did. And then he recommended each of us, and that's how we went. Years later, I was Guido's colleague and then succeeded him as the dean of the law school. But it was Guido who said to me, the best year I ever had was my year at Cambridge as the Goodhart professor at Trinity Hall. And that's when it sort of came into my mind, gee, I'd like to be the Goodhart professor someday. And my other colleague, John Langbein, also had a similar experience at Trinity Hall. So anyway, that's how I got here.
Thank you very much. You mentioned that in the 60s, your family was in Washington, and I'd somehow assumed that you grew up in New Haven, so you would have undertaken your early schooling, presumably in Washington?
No, it was only a year. So we were in Boston. So two interesting things about my childhood. Well, three interesting things. One, I had all of these brothers and sisters who were tremendously capable at both protected me and pushed me along. My older sister Carolyn was dean of the Chungang University. She's a PhD in chemistry. My brother Howard became Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services and under Obama, and Commissioner of Public Health of Massachusetts. And he is a professor at Harvard School of Public Health. And then my brother Edward is an MD, PhD in neuroscience, and became a anesthesiologist. And then my younger sister, Hongju Koh Peters, became the Goldman Professor of Law at Yale Law School. So we were, in the history of Yale University, which is more than 300 years, we were the first brother and sister to have chairs, which was very touching because our parents had taught there. So we have a picture of ourselves, my parents in 1965, standing in the faculty picture, and then us in 2005 in the faculty picture. So my father was very determined that we sort of forge ahead, so we all skipped many grades. And so I went to school when I was 4 years old, and I learned to read very early. I also had polio. My brothers and I all got a polio fever the last year before the vaccine was developed, and so they were older and had more immunities, but I had a series of painful operations. So I was both younger and sort of physically had more difficulty getting around. As a result, though, it hasn't been an inhibition in my life really. But it ended up that I went to school very early, and I graduated from college very early, age 20. And that's part of what led me to want to come to England for a couple of years. I thought, I spent my whole life being 2 years younger than everyone around me. And maybe I should, um, you know, get a little bit of maturing. And at that time, when I was graduating from college, I had gone to Korea many times, but I had never been to Europe. And I understood that I had a kind of Anglo-Saxon way of thinking, but I didn't actually understand what the origins of this were or the philosophical assumptions. And so I applied for a scholarship and I won this scholarship from the British government. And I came to Oxford and read philosophy, politics, and economics at Magdalen College, Oxford. And that's become a second home to me now.
So, you graduated BA from Harvard in 1975 at the
Correct.
age of 20, and you chose Harvard presumably because of your father's association.
Yeah, my father loved Harvard mainly because he had heard of Harvard in Korea. It's so big and famous that it was the only place he had really heard of. But it was very interesting. At one point, I'm almost embarrassed to say this on tape, he said, there are four great universities in the world: Harvard, Yale, Oxford, and Cambridge. And, I was educated at Harvard. I taught at Yale. I went to Oxford. And I'd never been to Cambridge. So that was another reason I came to the Goodhart. And now I feel that this kind of uh, dark spot has been illuminated.
You acted as a law clerk for Justice Harry A. Blackman of the
Yes.
US Supreme Court and Judge Malcolm Richard Wilkie. And this was about 1976. What were the circumstances of your obtaining these positions?
No, I graduated from Harvard College in government in 1975. I was originally a physics major, but I wasn't very good at physics, so I switched to government, political science. But I had a sort of incomplete liberal arts education in my own view. So then from 75 to 77, that's when I read PPE at Magdalen. So I went back to Harvard at law school in 1977 to 1980. And originally I wanted to do international law, but they didn't have much in the way of international law at Harvard at the time. The one person whose work I focused on a little bit there was Abram Chase, who was writing about international legal process, and that became a little bit of the focal point of my work on transnational legal process. Judge Wilkie just interviewed me. He was the general counsel of Kennecott Copper Corporation, and he had a very varied career in international law, international business, and in the government. There was a moment in college that really hit home, which is about U.S. foreign policy. They had a class, and they suddenly started talking about Henry Kissinger as a scholar diplomat. And I remember raising my hand and saying, what does that mean? And they said, well, there are some people who are professors and they have tenure, but they're also diplomats, and so they go back and forth. And they get benefits from both, in that when they're in the real world, they gain practical experience, and when they're in the academy, they can think bigger thoughts. And I said, who are such people? And they said, Henry Kissinger, John Kenneth Galbraith, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Lincoln Gordon, Robert Strauss Hoope. So I decided to write a paper about this, and I interviewed a bunch of these people. I mean, and it wasn't a very good paper, but it actually made me think, gee, this is a great idea if I could. And that idea stuck with me. And Judge Wilkie had a similar kind of career. He had been a practicing lawyer at the Justice Department, but then he had become an international lawyer for a major global corporation. So he assigned me to every international law matter that came before him, and he had cases on extraterritoriality and immunities. So that was my first real exposure to international law, but it was international law in domestic courts. And that's what made me think that, well, gee, that there's uh, the divide between domestic and international is very artificial. It's actually a transnational process. Justice Blackmun was a very internationally minded person also, and also thought very deeply about the law. And he also said, and if you want to work on the international cases, we don't have that many of them. So those 2 years, which are almost like a postgraduate study, was my understanding how international law was actually penetrating domestic law through the courts. And that just permanently affected the way I thought about law and practice. My father had a saying, theory without practice is as lifeless as practice without theory is thoughtless. And his view was you should do both theory and practice, both as kind of a check on each other. So almost from the very beginning, I did that. And I started at a law firm called Covington and Burling, which is a very well-known Washington firm that has a big international practice. It was coming off of the Iran hostages crisis, which I think now is kind of a pivotal moment in international law, and triggered a whole series of matters, including the Iran-U.S. Claims Tribunal, etc. So I ended up working on all these things. I represented the Iranian hostages on a pro bono matter. In the middle of it all, someone comes to me and says, how would you like to teach a course at night at George Washington Law School? And it turned out that another lawyer at the firm had been teaching this course with his friend, and then the friend had gone on maternity leave. And I was sort of petrified, and they said, you can use her lecture notes. They're all written out. They were stunningly complete. So the time I was at the law firm, I taught the course with him. He then went on leave, and she came back, and I then taught the course with her. And then the third year, I taught it by myself. And the book we used was called Steiner and Vatt's Transnational Legal Problems. And then someone asked me, do you want to write a book review of transnational legal problems? And I did. And then Detlef Vatz, who I had not known at Harvard Law School, contacts me and said, how would you like to update the book? So I became the co-author of the book, and transnational legal problems became the way that I looked at the world.
Right. So your academic career has been primarily at Yale, interspersed with periods of government service for democratic administrations, and this is an arrangement which would be unusual in the UK.
My first job was with Reagan.
Right.
So I worked for the Reagan administration Office of Legal Counsel at the Justice Department from 1983 to 85.
Right.
And I worked on such matters as, ratification of the Genocide Convention, the suit by Nicaragua against the United States at the International Court of Justice, the follow-on to the resolution of the Iran hostage crisis. But, I didn't vote for Reagan. And by the end of that period, I said to myself, I'm not going to work anymore for someone I didn't vote for.
Right. It's far more helpful if you are actually attached to the political cause.
Yes.
In terms of focusing your legal notions.
Oh, very much so.
Yes, it's quite helpful, I would think.
Well, in fact, it was very ironic. What happened was in 1989 fall, I got tenure, and my father passed away. This all happened very suddenly, and in the space of a few weeks. And then in the spring, my son was born. And I was teaching international business transactions at the time, which I liked, but I didn't care much. It wasn't something that touched my heart. And then we decided, students asked me, would you form a human rights clinic? Because we should be able to sue human rights violators. And I decided to do it with another guy called Michael Ratner, who I didn't know, but we started in the fall of 1990. And then we got involved with a suit on behalf of Haitian refugees in Florida, which was lost to the government very quickly. And then the students said to me, and I've been saying to them, the case should have been brought somewhere else. We'd have a better chance if it was brought in New York. And then they said to me, would you bring the case in New York? And I said, well, suing the U.S. government is a serious business. But then, I went to my father's grave, and I'm standing there, and I thought, I have all of the security that he never had. He told me to stand for principles. If I'm an immigrant with tenure at an Ivy League university, if I'm not going to do this, who else is going to do this? So I said, go ahead. And we just worked on this like crazy for 2 years and sued the Bush administration. I had never been in a court. I'd been in a court, but I never argued a motion even. And I argued 26 times in the next year and a half, including, I argued one motion standing at a speakerphone at a maitre d' station in a hotel lobby at Grand Central Station. And the case went to the Supreme Court, and I argued at the Supreme Court. It was the first case about Guantanamo. I went to Guantanamo. I went to Haiti. And I was, at the time, supporting Bill Clinton, who was running for president. But when he got elected, he reversed his own position, and he sustained Bush's policy, which was a bitter disappointment to me. I was told at the time, you have a good chance to be the legal advisor of the State Department. And a couple of people said to me, my colleagues, why don't you not argue the case and go into the government? You can do more good in the government. And I said, invoking my dad, I'm not going to serve a government that can't take the position consistent with the rule of law. I mean, these guys changed their view. And I said, if I never serve in the government, that's okay. Anyway, we lost on the law, but we sort of won in the court of public opinion eventually. And that showed me that the relationship between law and politics, that you can lose in court and the transnational legal process can play on. I then brought a suit on behalf of Cubans, Cuban Americans on Guantanamo in Florida. And people said to me, gee, nobody who represents the Haitians represents Cubans because one is sort of left people and the other is sort of right. And I said, I don't represent ethnic groups. I represent people who take particular legal positions. It's the same legal position. So I spent really 4 years suing the U.S. government and suing the party I had voted for, Clinton. In the middle of it all, I meet Hillary Clinton, who was at the time the first lady. And this is before Clinton adopted his view, and I was very impressed by her. I thought she was very sympathetic to our view. It turned out she was, and that she was pushing Bill Clinton to change the policy in the direction that we favored, and eventually he did. And then 1990, when all of this litigation ended, I was exhausted, and so we decided that we would come to England for a year. And I went to All Souls as a visiting professor. And my family came over and my children, and they made friends here in the UK. In fact, such good friends that we're still friends with these people now. We just attended the wedding of a young guy who was 3 years old when we first met him, and he's now a graduate student at Cambridge. I'm going to give him my printer. And then I went back, and it was 1997, And suddenly I got a call from Madeleine Albright's sort of right-hand man. And he had been my student, a fellow named Jim O'Brien. And he said, we'd like you to be Assistant Secretary for Human Rights. And I was kind of dumbfounded. And I said, I spent the whole last 4 years suing Clinton. And he said, yeah, that's why Madeleine wants you. He said, because everybody knows that if you defend us, you're not just doing it because it's in your political interest. It's because you believe it, that you're not a yes man. So anyway, I went in and I did that job. And then through that, I met a lot of people around Bill and Hillary Clinton, but particularly Hillary Clinton I worked with on a number of issues. It turned out later Hillary Clinton was the person who sort of cast the vote for me to get the job as Assistant Secretary for Human Rights. And I stayed in touch with her. And then I came back to the law school and became the dean. I did that from 2004 to 2009. And then, Obama got elected. And I actually supported Hillary. And I thought, well, this is too bad. And then suddenly Hillary became Secretary of State. And so they asked me to be the legal advisor of the State Department. So that's what happened. In 2013, after I had served for 4 years, I thought, Hillary will be president. So I think I'll leave now and come back in later. And so in 2016, I worked for her campaign, and I thought I would go. In the middle of it all, James Crawford and Ellie Lauterpack said, how would you like to be the Goodhart professor? And I thought, I'd love to be the Goodhart professor, but I'll probably be in the government, or I hope to be in the government, which is one reason why I didn't end up coming here for a while, And then suddenly she lost, and Trump became president. And then I thought, well, this is a good time to go back over to England. And what happened was I had started talking about the relationship between Trump and international law. And then I thought, I should really write this as a book. And so last spring, when I was at Trinity College, I finished my classes at Yale. I flew over here. I landed, and it was raining. Nobody knew who I was. And for 6 weeks, I just worked from morning till night. And it was great. I mean, this is what the college is equipped to do. Like I went over for lunch, went over for dinner, and I had no interruptions. And the book got finished. And then in September, it got published. And then in the middle of it all, I had said, people were emailing me, can you come and speak? And I said, I'm writing this book. Can I come in a year? Because I knew I would be back. So this spring, I've been to Sheffield, Nottingham, Leicester, Swansea, Dublin yesterday, Trinity College, Oxford, Cambridge, London. And it's kind of talking about the book. So I didn't set it up that way, but I'm glad that it worked out that way. It's been very rewarding.
And you mentioned on the Lauterpack Center profile page that you would be working on this forthcoming book.
Yeah.
Which has now been published, and it seems to me that you are very happy with it and its reception. You also said that you, in the second part of your fellowship, would focus on issues surrounding law and globalization for another book. Have you been able to make some progress on that?
Yes. So in 2014, I gave the Clarendon Law Lectures which are called Law and Globalization. It was a very simple idea that the three phases of law and globalization is the globalization of law is a feature of globalization, law as globalization. That law promotes globalization by connecting parts of the world, so the law in globalization. And then third, that the law of globalization is emerging as its own distinctive subject. So we have global criminal law, global property law, intellectual property. So it's really more of a way of understanding how globalization and law intersect. I've written most of it, but some of it I took out of that book and put it into the Trump book. I've just been having a conversation with OUP, Oxford Press, and also Yale Press. I'm interested now to update the National Security Constitution book in light of 9/11 and the Mueller report. And I think I'm going to do that first. The book is called the National Security Constitution, so I'm going to do a version called the 21st Century National Security Constitution, because I think that this is the logical follow-on. I think I'll do the Law and Globalization book as a much shorter book. The original 3 lectures. I am also supposed to write a book of on human rights. I gave lectures at European University Institute a few years ago, which is kind of my lecture on human rights, and it's supposed to be published as part of a series. Those tapes are all there and transcribed, and I would like to have my take on this done before I'm done. But I'm sort of more interested right now in writing about the issues that are the most current, because the attack by Trump on international law is so savage. To write an optimistic book about law and globalization, it's really about law and defense of globalization. Law as a defense to humane globalization. Globalization can occur in 2 ways. Simplistically put, it can impoverish the middle class and enhance inequality. That's Trump's position, that globalization has hurt the common man, and that therefore the answer is to end globalization and to become more nationalist. This is also the spirit of Brexit. Blame immigrants, fortress America. The way to make America great again is to stop being global. And my view is that this is profoundly ignorant and wrong-headed, partly because there are so many global problems that have to be addressed collectively. You're not going to solve climate change by yourself. And partly because it's just a misunderstanding of, globalization can be managed in a humane way, so it has a human face, or it can just evolve in such a way that the rich get richer. And a kind of laissez-faire approach tends to lead to increasing inequality, which is what we've seen. So all of these topics are connected one to the other. I will get to them all in time, but I work on the thing that I think is the most timely. What I'm working on at the moment most directly, and I wrote an article about this, is Trump's belief is that he can withdraw from treaties at will by himself. Now, Trump, because he's so weak politically, he likes to do things that he thinks he can do on his own, and that includes pardon people, take away security clearances, deny people press passes. These are bad, but they're not destructive of the system. But the most destructive has been his claim that he can by himself withdraw from any treaty he wants. And so he's withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, or trying to, the Iran nuclear deal, the 2 treaties with Iran, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia. And an obvious question is, could Trump tomorrow tweet, "I withdraw from every treaty of which the United States is a party"? That would bring down the structure of international law. Now, when you had the exact same issue over here in the UK, can the UK withdraw from the EU without parliamentary participation? The answer was no. So I think that same issue is coming to a head in the US. So I wrote a long article about that last summer as a follow-on to the book.
Where was that published?
The Yale Law Journal. Actually, the Yale Law Journal Forum. It's called Presidential Power to Terminate International Agreements. And it's challenging this claim that the president has this cross-cutting unilateral power. I mean, I think Brexit is a good example. It's funny because the way that this notion got currency in academia was the thought that the United States or the president might have to suddenly get out of some entangling alliance, and that the danger would be that we would be stuck in some agreement that would be threatening to our national interests. What I think we've seen from Brexit is the greater danger is you try to get out without thinking through the consequences. Our connections, international and domestic, are so deeply intertwined. To cut the fabric of our legal connections is like trying to pull all the red threads out of a tapestry and thinking you're not going to destroy the tapestry. What are we seeing? Yesterday I was in Ireland, and I was talking in Dublin. I was talking to someone, and we were eating sandwiches, and he goes, my friend said, it's a little hard to just get out of the EU if everything in your sandwich has been back and forth across the border 15 times. And I think that's what you're experiencing, is that international and domestic are so deeply intertwined. The idea that you can just, Nigel Farage style, say, we want to be independent is naive and a myth.
So we're actually now moving on to your published work, and in this regard, you are a very obviously prolific writer and thinker on issues in international law, and your faculty website lists 11 books and monographs, and I've seen that you've done more or less 150 journal articles. So obviously I've been unable to read these in depth. I've just skimmed them, but I've benefited greatly from reviews, and I've selected 4 of your books, which you could just briefly touch on.
Sure.
Your National Security Constitution, your recent book, The Trump Administration, International Law, and then I selected 2 in between, the 2005 Foundations of International Law and Politics, and your 2008 Transnational Litigation in United States Courts. And it seems to me that issues of transnationalism in international law are a dominant theme during your research career. And in the acknowledgement of your first book, your National Security Constitution, you said that your interest in constitutional law and foreign affairs started in the 1980s when you were clerk to Justice Harry Blackmun. So it seems to me he was your initial inspiration, and you actually wrote a tribute to him in 1994. So is it possible to summarize perhaps the legacy of your association with Justice Blackmun, which has possibly influenced the original developments of your notions of transnationalism?
Yeah, Justice Blackmun is the most, apart from my father, the person with whom I have the strongest emotional connection. He was a very modest man, but incredibly hardworking. He traveled a lot, and he was very modest about America versus other countries. And one point he made to me quite a bit was that, when the United States was a young nation at the beginning, it was very respectful of international law. This is what young nations do, that they declare fidelity to international law as a way of being accepted on the world stage. So, some people talk about originalism. Originalism means we're globalist. We're inherently global. So someone like, Brett Kavanaugh, the new justice, who was my student, claims to be an originalist, and he's an anti-globalist. That's not possible. If you're an originalist, you're a globalist. And early on, the Supreme Court said unanimously, international law is part of our law and shall be applied as often as courts of appropriate jurisdiction shall apply it. And that means that we have a permeable system, that international norms enter our system and become domestic law. And these norms come both from international affairs, the 12-mile limit in the law of the sea, and they come from human rights law. I'll never forget, Justice Blackmun said to me, we were discussing whether you could execute a child. And I pointed out to him that this was barred by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which the United States was not a party to, but barred everywhere in the world. And he pointed out to me that the U.S. has an Eighth Amendment clause that prevents cruel and unusual punishments. And if nobody else does it, it's unusual. The other was when we were talking about equality. He said to me, equality is not American property. The French had égalité, fraternité, liberté. It was the United States Bill of Rights, and it came at the same time as French Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man. So universal human rights is not something that the United States somehow owns and can therefore just ignore at its will. So what Justice Blackmun, I think, taught me was that this intertwining of international and domestic law is both natural and original. And there are a bunch of people who swim against this tide and want to rewrite history. I don't think they're particularly persuasive. But it's very interesting because I think that the way that they do it is they try to denude international law of influence by saying, I focused in on this little rule. Can you track influence from this rule? Well, the way that rules affect things is that they're deeply interconnected. You sent me, for example, this book review by Goldsmith, who is another one of my students. And the two things that struck me about it, he's a very pessimistic guy. He's kind of sad, a dark view of the world. From his perspective, Trump has already won. He's given up. And but more fundamentally, he wants to divide, sort of isolate the impact of an international rule and then say, see, it doesn't have any power. Well, that's exactly what you don't do. It's interconnectedness with all the other rules and political incentives, et cetera, that what gives it its force. Sometimes the international norm can be the glue that makes the difference. So if we're speaking today, the day after Memorial Day. Trump proposed to pardon soldiers who had committed war crimes. Anyway, he didn't do it. And there was this massive protest. And it's a combination of things. It obviously violates the Geneva Conventions. The International Committee of the Red Cross spoke against it. Those generals in the U.S. Army and also military people in other countries all protested. They made it clear that Trump would lose the support of his generals, which is kind of a political thing. But it scared him off doing something that he was just focused on the short-term impact on one tiny constituency, and now he's backed off. Now, Trump is a willful and difficult enough person that it's not over. But that's the mistake of trying to isolate these things.
Yes.
This also goes, by the way, to the relationship between law and politics and law and political science. I don't think that what I'm studying is a science. I think it's a craft. And A good example is that the political scientists have become very quantitative, and they do the same thing. How do we measure? And what I like to say is, if you can't measure what's important, you make important what you can measure. So I remember being at a conference where someone was talking about treaty violations and can you count treaty violations and measure the impact of law? And I finally said to him, suppose you go to dinner at High Table and you have too many glasses of wine. And then you get into your car and you drive home. But because you don't want to be stopped, you take a different way and you drive very slow and you stop at every light. And if you're tired, you pull over and you make it home and you never encounter the police. Every single action was influenced by law, but there's no violation. So how am I going to count that? I mean, this is the same criticism goes to Goldsmith. They want to isolate the impact of the international rule and then say the impact of the international rule is not significant, and that therefore, international law doesn't matter. But that's again a conclusion driving analysis. It shows someone who isn't kind of steeped in the way that international law really works in the world. When I come over here, there's a culture in Cambridge, and you discern the culture and you try to fit into the culture, even if without sacrificing your core identity. And that's not dissimilar to what happens when America tries to adjust to the system of international law.
Coming then specifically to your first book, which you've touched on, it was at the time extremely well received, and it focused on the flaws which you've touched on apropos the Trump administration, the balance of US foreign policy implementation by the three fora of the balance in US foreign policy implementation by the three fora of state power. And so who did you actually write that book for initially? Was it a teaching tool intended as, or?
Well, there are two answers. I wrote it for myself to understand it, but I wrote it to explain the Iran-Contra affair. The Iran-Contra affair was, this moment in the Reagan administration where a sort of shadow foreign policy was created. And people were talking about it like it was Watergate. And I thought, no, the Iran-Contra affair is really a foreign policy crisis like Vietnam. And that in this effort to try to figure out who's the culprit, they weren't blaming the system. The system is the culprit. So how is the system the culprit? And it occurred to me there are two visions of the Constitution. One is a vision of what I call executive unilateralism. The president can do whatever he wants. And then the other is a system of checks and balances, which I think is captured in the Youngstown case, this steel seizure, which is the courts, Congress, and the president check each other. And these two visions, extreme executive power and balanced institutional participation, have been warring in U.S. history. There are periods in which one is more assertive and the other is recessive, and vice versa. But the irony is that that's the constitutional legal vision. The political vision, or the political problem, is that each of these branches has incentives, political incentives. And whether the president is strong or whether the president is weak, he has an incentive to do things by himself. I mean, look at Trump. He can't get things through Congress because they're so outrageous. So he tries to figure out a way to claim he has exclusive power to do it. Then Congress has incentives to not be on the record, to acquiesce, to not be responsible. And then the courts have an incentive to decline to adjudicate. So the executive unilateralism vision keeps reasserting itself because the president acts, Congress acquiesces, and the courts defer even if the president is wrong. And so there's a tension between the legal desideratum, which is balanced power, and the way that political life unfolds. And so you have a moment like 9/11 where Bush wildly overreacted to the 9/11 attacks. And, essentially the courts and Congress both deferred, which was a mistake, and therefore did not protect the vision of the national security constitution. So the book that I want to write now doesn't start with the Iran-Contra affair. It starts in the middle of the book, which is the beginning of the American Republic, and to try to sketch the emergence of these two visions. And then I'll get to the modern day, and I'll talk first about the Iran-Contra affair that's already written. Then I'll talk about 9/11. I've written lots of articles about that. And then I'll talk about the Trump administration as kind of a outer limit of this outrageous claims of executive power. As we speak, Leslie, the president is saying it's a national emergency at the border that requires you to separate parents from their children. I mean, this is outrageous. And so I'm going to call this one the 21st Century National Security Constitution because I'd like it to have a little bit of a longer half-life. So this is an idea I keep returning to. Maybe this is the point. The big idea that has been driving me throughout my career is how to preserve the rule of law in international affairs, and particularly of my country, my adopted country. And I see the country as having great potential to do good, but also great potential to do evil and to seek exemptions for itself, to be exceptionalist in a bad way. And the two ways to do it, I think, are to put external pressure, engage, translate, interact, interpret, internalize. That's transnational legal process. The other is for the forces within the government to play a restraining role on executive adventurism. And what I say in the Trump book is that the combination of this inside and outside check work together to restrain Trump. So, one reason why we see so much activity by Trump is because everything he's doing is being blocked. So to the outside world, it looks like everything he's doing is succeeding. But in fact, he keeps shifting to new policies because the last one got blocked. Now, it's funny because when I read Goldsmith's review, which this depressing review, his view was Trump is doing unbelievable damage. It's all over. In 2 years, he said, in 2 years, it's all over. We've had this system in place for hundreds of years. I don't think it falls apart that fast. Now, that doesn't mean we're not. We have a very bad president who's stumbling around trying to destroy what's been created. So it's a bull in a china shop. But the china shop's been around for a long time.
So you've mentioned your Trump book, which is a jump 30 years later from the Constitution book. And your Trump administration has received high praise from inter alia Professor Allett, who admires it greatly and calls it a searingly clear analysis of the Trump administration's challenges to international law. So it seems that history has turned full circle. We're back in this unbalanced world that you visited in your 1990 book. And would you agree that there's some truth in this analogy of déjà vu? We're back again with this.
Yeah. Well, Yogi Berra, the American baseball player, said it's déjà vu all over again. There's a kind of amnesia that afflicts people. it's part of the notion that what's going on is a problem with bad people rather than bad structure. So, if it's a bad people, then throw the rascals out and everything's fine. If it's a bad structure, then the problems will recur even with good people. And that's been my position. So I really have two ideas. I mean, I was kind of simplistic. One is the national security constitution, checks and balances in U.S. foreign policy, and the other is transnational legal process, which is how to check rogue actors in international affairs through external and internal systems. And the Trump book is kind of bringing those two ideas together. I think that one of the tragedies has been of the last 20 years, the Republicans like George W. Bush or Trump are wildly aggressive in the wrong direction, using and abusing executive power, and led by people like John Bolton. The Democrats, after criticizing this, undercorrect. And, so I think that Obama undercorrected for Bush. I think Bob Mueller undercorrected for Comey. And as a result, the pendulum was pushed very hard to the right and then pushed only partway back. And so the pendulum keeps moving in that direction. And that's why the next election is so important, because you need to have someone with the courage and vision and experience, frankly, to push hard in the right direction.
You mentioned the review by Professor Goldsmith, and he assumes that your main thesis is that Trump is trying to alter US foreign policy on the issues which you've mentioned: immigration, trade agreements with China, Paris Agreement, Iran deal, use of force. And he says that by and large, Trump has failed to achieve his goals because the transnational legal process has hindered him. Do you think this is a fair summary of your thesis by Professor Goldsmith, that in fact these components, the transnational legal process, have in fact set Trump back?
That's my thesis, and if that's what he says, that's my view is Trump is not winning. Goldsmith's counter view, although he doesn't say it so explicitly, is the sky is falling. That Koh's optimism blinds him to the fact that we're in a world of grievous destruction. And my view is, it's a little early. It's a little early to take such a depressive view of the world. A big part of my book, if I were to say there's 3 parts: Trump is not winning, although he's battering the system. 2, the reason he's not winning is because transnational legal process preserves the fidelity of the rule of law, even against these kind of rogue elephants. But 3rd, the outcome is not a foregone conclusion, that we need to fight for it, that each of the issue areas I discussed are areas where there's been a concerted effort to push back on Trump, and then he's given way. So what I didn't understand about Goldsmith's book review is, on the one hand, he acknowledges the basics of what I said, but then his bottom line seems to be, oh gee, it's really terrible, let's give up. Trump has done grievous damage. It's over. And my view is, it's a little early to make that kind of assessment. And by the way, if that is your assessment, then it's easy to give up, which is not what I'm interested in doing.
And he says that it's clear that Trump's modus operandi is unconventional, and one can see that he's generally clumsy, if not incompetent, at wielding executive power. And he asks, isn't this alone sufficient to account for any of his failures? And Goldsmith seems to think that it's not necessary to as you have done, attribute this Trump's failures to a descriptive analytical tool?
Well, Goldsmith was my student. I don't think he's the shrewdest observer. I think what he'd like to do is distinguish between, he's also an executive power advocate who also doesn't believe much in international law. I think what he would really like to do is to treat Trump as aberrational, but try to normalize George W. Bush and say, see, Mitt Romney or someone could be a reasonable approach because they're not incompetent. And, he doesn't like Obama. He constantly is criticizing Obama and Hillary Clinton. And, my view is this is, well, I think it's false. And I think it's, he has a kind of, as I said, depressed view of the world, which I think is too bad. Life is too short to have such a discouraged view of the world. I tend to be, as I've explained, in my own life, there are so many moments where it should have been over, or where doom was upon us. but here I'm sitting in this beautiful college and talking to someone who's been nice enough to look at my work. How can I feel so pessimistic about the possibilities of the world? And so let's face it, we have a terrible moment in our lifetime. The combination of Trump and Brexit is devastating, but they're not over. And the idea that the forces of international law should somehow surrender or strikes me as premature and really against the idea of progress in civilization. I mean, so maybe we will be overwhelmed by climate change because people like Trump will discourage the political forces from doing anything. But I still think there's time, and I still think that people can see the light. And I think it's the duty of those of us who care about, as I say, law in the process of humane globalization to push for that outcome. I mean, that's certainly what I see my life's mission as. I mean, if you want to be a naysayer or doomsayer, I mean, there's a role for such people, and they help people surrender to. It's a good invitation to be passive, and in my view, that's not how you live your life. If my parents had been passive, my mother would be in North Korea, and my father would be in a fishing village, buried in a cemetery somewhere, and I wouldn't exist. So, I mean, they fought hard to change their own existence, and I think that's the way progress gets made.
So, a final question on your last book, and this is to bring UK politics in. One area where you do make direct reference to the UK in your book is the matter of Brexit, and on page 92, you imply that military actions in Syria have destabilised that country and that this conflict inter alia caused Brexit, presumably reference to the refugee influx into Europe. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, well, one of the controversial positions that I hold is that I was the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights during Kosovo and after Rwanda. And it seems to me that there is a role for preventing genocide and war crimes before they happen. And that's what we tried to do in Libya. The follow-through was imperfect, but we saved hundreds of thousands of lives. The idea that you don't have any responsibilities to people in a distant place when they're being subjected to gross violations, I think, is wrong. I think we thought, or that Syria could implode, and that's their problem. That's certainly the claim that Trump is now making. But it's not so easy. You know, it was one of the stable points of the Middle East. It's destabilized the Middle East. It put astonishing pressure on Turkey. Turkey has now gone very nationalist and conservative. You know, Erdogan has become a human rights violating dictator. You know, Jordan is under incredible pressure. Egypt is under incredible pressure. And as a result, they've become much more nationalist. Germany was under assault because Merkel allowed people to come in. And then it started to create a feeling of fortress UK. And all of this started to come to a head about the time that the Brexit referendum was happening. And then the forces of fear and xenophobia, led people to make a vote that God only knows what they thought they were voting, and they were being demagogued by people who were misstating the costs. And 3 years later, we're still in it. And I mean, here's the real point, Leslie, is that there are real problems in the world. And for the last 3 years, the UK has been struggling to deal with its own self-inflicted wound. And we every day have to get up and deal with Trump generating problems when, the Chinese and the Russians are very focused on their own objective, While Trump is attacking the World Trade Organization and the World Bank and NATO, the Chinese are quietly building the Belt and Road Initiative and their own bank. And, their view is, okay, so we had to live 70 years under this Western liberal post-war order, but now's our moment. These guys are distracted, and therefore we can be focused. And, Putin, his view is, extrapolating from where he is, I can interfere in the electoral systems of foreign countries and get away with it. So if you have a second referendum in the UK, what's to protect the UK from having Trump use bots and trolls to try to influence that? We have 22 candidates running for president of the United States. Why can't they use the exact same methods to tip it toward the person who Trump can beat, who I think is probably Bernie Sanders? That we have no confidence now in the integrity of the process. And so the denialist approach to these things, as, Santayana said, if you don't learn from history, you're destined to relive it.
Yes. Your next book, Your Transnational Litigation in United States Courts, was, to me personally, particularly interesting because it was one of the lectures you gave at The Hague. And I've had the great privilege of interviewing Judges Higgins, Schwabel, Crawford, and Professors Lautbach and Bowert, who also contributed to The Hague. And I wondered if you could say something about the Hague experience.
Oh, I love the Hague Academy. I love the Hague generally. I'm going to Hague next week to argue at the International Court of Justice in Ukraine versus Russia, and then to argue at the Law of the Sea Tribunal, also in Ukraine versus Russia. But in January, just before I came to start the second and third terms here at Cambridge, I gave the keynote speech at the first winter session of the Hague Academy of International Law on American schools of international law. This is, by the way, another one of my projects. There's an Australian scholar, Anthea Roberts, has written a book, Is International Law Really International? And she's basically arguing that Americans don't believe in international law. Now, this may be true of someone like Goldsmith, but it's not true of me. Or I would argue of the vast mainstream of American international lawyers. So that's kind of a jurisprudential strand. The Hague Academy, I think, is a remarkable world resource. And I was very lucky to be invited. Peter Truboff, who is the American member of the Curatorium, was my first boss at Covington and Burling, and he got me invited there in 1993. It's not a great story about myself. I had been litigating this Hague, the Haitian refugee case, nonstop, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for almost 15 months. And the Supreme Court decided the case, and the Haitians on Guantanamo who were representing were released on June 20-something, June 21st. And 3 days later, I had to go to The Hague to give these lectures. So ideally, I should have written the lectures before. Instead, I went and gave the best lectures I could give under the circumstance. But then I then essentially wrote them for publication. And then they were published as a private volume at the Recueil de Cour. Then, after 5 years, the copyright reverts to you. And so then I thought, gee, this is still pretty current, and there haven't been that many new cases, and I ought to be able to do this. So I revised and updated it and then published it. But my son, William, to whom it's dedicated along with my daughter, when I went to give lectures in The Hague in 1993, the first round, he was 3 years old. And when the book came to me in that form, he was going off to college. and it just shows you that books gestate as long as children. But it got done, and I'm happy with it, and I may update it at some point in the future. Who knows? But by the way, this is something that really began when I was clerking for Justice Blackmun and Judge Wilkie. One of the cases I talk about at some length, Piper versus Reno, was the term I clerked for the Supreme Court. Almost every case discussed in some detail I worked on in some fashion from between 1980 and when the book came out. So it goes back to, I'm a baseball fan, and the great hitter was Ted Williams. And he used to get hits all the time. We idolized him. And they asked him once, why are you so good? And he said, I never swing unless it's in the strike zone. And I remember seeing this when I was 3 or 4 years old. And I said to my father, gee, that's very obvious. And he said, no, he's a genius. And I said, why? And he said, do you know how many people don't know their strike zone? He said, you have to know what your focus is, and then if it's in that zone of focus, give it your all and swing with all your might. And if it's even outside a little bit, just stay away, because you don't want to divert your energy. And what it did was, this transnational litigation issue, I started to watch this strike zone in 1980. And I remember at the time thinking, I'll never master this. But, 39 years later, almost everything that passed through that strike zone, I ended up having some little piece of. And it gave me a kind of overview that I thought I might as well write it down. So the different areas on which I'm trying to give a scholarly focus: the national security constitution, transnational legal process, law and globalization, transnational public law litigation, how it affects our current situation with Trump and Brexit, are all an effort to use this microscopic lens of the strike zone to see deeper than the most obvious superficial analysis.
Have there been, since the book was published, many Supreme Court cases bearing on international law?
No, surprisingly few. Probably the only big one is a case called JAM versus International Finance Corporation. It's about the immunity of an international organization. And I wrote a brief in that case for a group of scholars with some other people, in which we argued that an international organization should not have more immunity than its member states. And that was a position that prevailed before the Supreme Court. So that's been the main one. It's not necessarily directly connected to any of these issues, but strangely, the Supreme Court's docket has started to decline. When I was a law clerk in 1981, 82, they heard 130 cases a year in full argument. Now they hear about 60, less than half. They used to hear about 3 or 4 international cases a year. Now they hear about 2, which, by the way, I think is both bad and good. It's bad because there's so many issues they've never really addressed that are critical to American society. I mean, the justices barely understand the internet. A number of our justices supposedly don't have passports, which makes them incredibly insular. You know, it's no surprise that Stephen Breyer, the most internationalist, was a Marshall Scholar, is married to a British woman, speaks French, you know. Therefore, it doesn't see the United States as the center of everything. Whereas others, I think, have this very limited view.
I found a review of this book by Professor Anupam Chanda, and he is very complimentary and says that you set yourself a mammoth task in sorting out this huge array of topics in international jurisprudence to make a coherent picture. And he says the book is lucid, has economic explanations, sophisticated, and a major contribution to the field. And he characterizes your notions of uploading domestic law to international law, downloading international law into domestic law, and horizontal transplanting across jurisdictions as cross-cutting dynamics, allowing you to move back and forth between US federal decisions and international conventions. And I wondered where you conceived this scheme from, and whether it was from your association with Justice Harry Blackmun.
Well, it certainly began there. At Yale, for years, I taught international business transactions, which is one such topic. I taught human rights, which is another such topic. I taught immigration, which is another such topic. These are transnational in the sense that they are hybrids between domestic and international. I taught international trade law, which is also hybrid. And so the idea, again, is that international concepts developed in the international law realm are downloaded. Here's a good example. You know, in the UK, we have the metric system. Is that a British concept or is it an international concept? It's a hybrid. Or, you know, .com. You know, there are .coms everywhere. Is that an international concept or is it a domestic concept? It's a hybrid. So that's why I use the word transnational. In many respects, it is artificial to characterize things as international or domestic anymore. This is a Benthamite construction that was imposed on the law as a way of understanding it. And I think now it confuses more than it clarifies. I think what that book would be nice for him to say it. What I tried to do in the transnational litigation book is, instead of just talking about topics and cases, I wanted to extract themes that explain why the courts rule in particular directions. Like some of it is to protect the autonomy of parties to contracts. Some of it is separation of powers. Some of it is sovereignty. And that in different cases you see Comedy is another. You see the courts invoking different ideas and giving different ones higher or lower priority. And sometimes one or the other is more controlling of the outcome. But I think the idea was you could have 10 cases in apparently concerning different aspects of a lawsuit, immunities, choice of forum, choice of law, enforcement of judgments. But these same themes are cross-cutting, and that, it's a very consistent pattern of being invoked. Now, different justices invoke them in different ways, and you have different coalitions. And I think that's what the book review was getting at, which is the idea is to give the reader a sense that when you approach these things, there are only so many ideas that the justices are bringing to their analysis.
I was intrigued by your description in your book, page 248 to 252, and then the last few pages, 258 to 60, of the two strands in US Supreme Court thinking, the transnationalist judges and the nationalistic judges. How have things evolved since 2008, especially in the development of a global legal system?
Well, obviously the two Trump appointees, Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, are nationalists. The last two Obama appointees, Sotomayor, who speaks Spanish, and Kagan, are transnationalists. So it's 2 and 2. Some of the justices who got off the court, Souter, O'Connor, and Kennedy, had transnationalist leanings. Roberts, who's the Chief Justice, is a strong nationalist. So right now there's a 5-4 majority for a nationalist position. My view, this is very unfortunate. The United States is the leading global power. They should be. What Justice Blackmun said, which was very simple, and he said in the Aerospatiale case, is an American judge should not simply think about what's good for America. They should think about whether the rule that's being adopted leads to the smoother functioning of the international system. So in the same way as, you pick a legal rule that makes the United States as a nation operate better in a system of global commerce, why doesn't a rule of judicial interpretation make the world markets operate better? Now, this leads to this sovereignty objection, which is, I find it almost comical. You can't apply foreign law. And, the United States, you should apply American law. And this to me is like saying you can't put kimchi in a taco. America is a nation of borrowers, and it amalgamates culinary traditions. Everything is a hybrid. And I'm married to an Irish woman. It's crazy to say. You mean I can put kimchi in a taco and enjoy that, and I can't borrow British law and put into U.S. opinion. In fact, the United States jurisprudence has a history of borrowing from the UK and the Commonwealth, not to mention other countries. So one isn't, again, it's not dissimilar to Trump. It's a kind of insulated Fortress America view of the law versus an inclusive, looking for the best global principles.
It reminds me of a question on the notion of statehood and sovereignty, which, in relation to the interview I had with Judge Crawford last year, and he said that in respect to the Montevideo Convention for Statehood, he said, let's get rid of the Montevideo Convention. It's imperfect, it's partial, and we have to clarify our concepts. Nevertheless, apropos the necessity for recognising states for the functioning of international law, he also said that in the present conception of international law, yes, states are necessary to solve the problems of the world. International law is a law of coordination addressed to human problems, and these can't be solved by individual assertions of sovereignty, but by coordination. Does this mean that your transnationalistic Supreme Court vision equates with the Crawfordian vision, while the nationalist view adheres more to the Montevideo Convention scenario?
Yeah, I mean, for example, a nation. So the international, inter-national vision thinks that international law is for states only. The nation of Tuvalu versus Microsoft is not comparable. You know, private collections of power and influence and collaborations among private actors is what makes law. Now, the main point is that this was the originalist vision. The original notion of a lex mercatoria, or a law merchant, when Marco Polo went to buy noodles from Chinese people or vice versa and had to pay them in the markets, there was no national law that governed it. They were from different countries. They developed a transnational law of commerce, which has come to be known as the law merchant, the lex mercatoria. The British carried that law because of their naval power and also their colonial power. So, and then the U.S. inherited it. So what Judge Crawford is saying is to focus in on those states that meet the narrow Montevideo criteria as the only meaningful players when you have, so many other transnational actors. I mean, this is the theme of my book on Trump. Climate change is not controlled by the United States. I mean, Trump is a powerful actor in this story, but so is a zillion other entities. And they can all push in a different direction. And in fact, make up for some of the losses by Trump and the deficits. And so if we think that it's for states only, then we say there's nothing we can do. If we think we are participants and we own it too, it imposes on us a moral duty to try to participate. I mentioned that my brothers are doctors. I'll never forget, my father said when they got their medical degrees, he said, I quote this in the book, he said, before you understood the human body, you didn't have an obligation to heal people, moral obligation. He said, you didn't know how. He said, but you have that knowledge. And that conveys with it this ethical obligation to make people healthier. If I understand how the body politic works or the body legal works, I have a moral obligation to try to make that system work better and not collapse, or not just say the sky has already fallen. And if I didn't know, I wouldn't know how to affect it. If I do know, I'm a participant in the process. And why should I defer to a Donald Trump? I mean, he's certainly a player in it, and he certainly has resources, and he certainly has authorities. But if he's mucking it up, we need the forces on the other side. This is the role that universities play. This is the role that knowledge plays. Maybe this is a bad moment. Another thing that my father said to me is the world is filled with good people and good countries and bad governments. I mean, look at you. As we speak, you have no prime minister here, and we have Donald Trump as our president. But I've been traveling around the UK. What a wonderful country. And, the United States, is still the same country that elected Obama or that cast more than 3 million votes for Hillary Clinton over Trump. So I can't give up on these things. But the law is not made by these public entities alone.
Thank you. Your last book that we'll look at briefly is the compilation with Professor Una Hathaway, Foundations of International Law and Politics. And here you select mainly journal articles to illustrate various concepts bringing international law and international relations together. And these articles range in age from 1994 HLA Hart's article to your own in 2005. And what motivated you to compile this book? Was it, again, primarily a teaching aid?
So George Bernard Shaw said that America and England are two countries divided by a common language. It turns out international law and international relations are two disciplines divided by methodology. So the world of international law talks about things, relations among transnational actors making legal rules, where the international relations talk about how powerful entities in the system interact with each other and create norms. And they don't do much to translate the idea of norms into the idea of law. My teacher, Abram Chase, said international relations scholars hate to say the L word. Now, I was struck by this because I studied political science and then I went to law. And it was almost like, we would study the exact same subjects, like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in one thing, we'd study entirely from a kind of political science perspective. And on the other, we'd suddenly talk about the legal rules that were made, and never would the twain meet. And, so for example, at Cambridge, you have a phenomenal international law faculty, but you also have a politics and international relations department. At Oxford, they have something, I gave a lecture over there, politics and international relations. But they also have international law. But very often these disciplines don't talk to each other. Hello?
Hi.
Oh, hold on. This is my student coming in. Hi, Tondo. How are you doing? Come on in.
Thank you.
You mind having a seat here?
No.
Yeah, this is Leslie Dingle. This is Tondo.
Pleasure to meet you.
She's a friend of my student at Yale, and we've been trying to get together for a while. Just have a seat over here. We're finishing up the conversation. So in the late 1990s, there was an effort funded by the Ford Foundation to try to bridge the gap between international law and international relations. I think it got to a certain place, and then I think to be honest, the international relations people, I don't think appreciated as much about the role of law. I gave you the example of someone who has law-influenced behavior but never violates the law. The international relations methodology is counting, and they're looking for data points. And I think they end up, therefore, ignoring pervasive influence, etc. So the point of the book was to try to pick readings so that people on both sides of this scholarly divide could understand what the other people are thinking and see the deep connections. Because it shouldn't be, as it was for me, that, when I'm studying international relations, I'm reading a bunch of literatures and learning these jargons. And I'm thinking, what does this have to do with international law? Then I get to the international law side and nobody mentions the international relations literature that I'd been reading. It was crazy. So that was what the book was intended to do. It can be used in college courses. It can be used in graduate programs in international relations. but it can also be used in international law, theory courses, etc.
I was interested to see in your preface that you cite Professor Myers McDougall as a pioneer in the modern collaboration between international law and international relations. And of course, he was someone under whose spell Dame Rosalind Higgins fell.
Yes.
And she was enchanted by him when she was at Yale. And he taught her that, and I quote from her interviews, that international law is not about rules, but mostly about norms. And these were concepts that she hadn't met here in Cambridge. Was there still a lingering legacy of the spell of this extraordinary man by the time that you arrived at Yale? And did this somehow influence you?
Yeah, he was there the first 5 years I was there. He passed away. I mean, he was a very dominating force. He was a gigantic guy. I mean, he was about 6'3", but huge person and with a very powerful personality. Also very funny, charismatic. He was the founder of the New Haven School. I've written two things. 2007 Yale Journal of International Law called "Is There a New New Haven School of International Law?" I think the Transnational Legal Process School is the new New Haven School. It's a combination of norms and process. So I think it's actually a cross between Harvard's international legal process and Yale's policy science approach. And then I've just written a chapter in a book by Jeffrey Dunoff and I think it's Mark Pollack called The New New Haven School. And the speech I just gave at the Hague Academy on American Schools of International Law argues that, in fact, this transnational legal process view is the dominant approach to international law in the United States. So here's another way to put it. You hear a lot about kind of schools that are more at the margins. So there's what I call there's a critical school, left's critical school, with people like David Kennedy. Marty Koskianimi is connected to that. There is a Chicago school, kind of law and economics school. People like Andrew Guzman, Eric Posner, they believe it's all economic incentives. There's a kind of Harvard school, Goldsmith, is very much a nationalist school, Curtis Bradley. So all of these get attention. But in fact, if you look at 90% of what's going on in U.S. international law, it's transnational legal process. So my view is that is actually, I call it the new New Haven School. It's, I think, an advancement beyond what McDougall did. It builds on kind of Harvard and Yale's. In fact, it just sort of reflects the influences that I saw, plus this international relations theory you mentioned. All of these international influences come in.
Thank you. Well, I could ask you questions endlessly about this, but sadly, time is running out. And so, just to conclude, what would you describe as the highlights of your time in Cambridge?
Well, I think there are two. The experience around writing the book and then having a chance to workshop it with many parts of the UK has been a real joy. I mean, it's nice to return. I mean, when I was here a year ago, this was in my mind, and now I'm talking to people who are reacting to it, and that's given me a whole set of new thoughts for the next 10 years. The other was just the emotional experience of being at Cambridge as an adult. When I went to Oxford as a student, what's the best way to put it? I was terrified by the university. I was, young, and the whole place seemed to be full of invisible rules and who am I and what am I doing there? And I just somehow felt, I would never be comfortable or at home. And I was constantly afraid of picking up the wrong fork. And I think it was only toward the end of the 2 years that I started to appreciate the wonderful people and the wonderful country and the brilliance of the university, etc. This time around, here I am. I'm in the later stages of my career, so I'm actually happy that I don't have to worry about these things anymore. That I'm not as for example, I noticed the other day I went to a dinner and they brought out a little glass of water or a bowl of water with lemon in it, and so I thought I was supposed to put my fingers in it, and somebody else picked up and started drinking it. So, this kind of thing would have shattered me. But in fact, it was just funny. But I think I just read C.P. Snow's book, The Masters, and which is obviously about how the Master of Christ gets chosen. And so that was fascinating to read in its own right, and partly because it grows out of the culture of Cambridge. But then at the very end, there's an appendix where he describes how Cambridge University came into existence. And it reminds me of this statement that some authors are architects and some are gardeners. And the gardeners plant seeds, and then the seeds come up in different ways and make a garden. And this kind of organic, bottom-up way in which Cambridge became this world-class university, and that the colleges and the structure of the colleges and the social life and political life grew out of that. And that's really how the story of the Masters fits into some broader scheme. That's what I think I appreciate more now is, I've lived in universities my whole life. And in fact, my parents have lived in universities in several continents. But there's something very special. I mean, the universities that exist around the world are modeled, including my own. Yale is modeled on Oxford and Cambridge. And so that's been the best thing. And I think I always feared Cambridge as kind of this other place. But now I feel like it's a little bit of a home to me. That's nice.
Thank you. Well, all that remains is to thank you again so much for this fascinating account. I'm very grateful to you.
Oh, thank you for all the work
time.
you did. Yeah, I'm very touched. She's interviewing me for an archive that they have here for the professorship I'm holding.
Thank you again.
Great.